Good morning, everyone. I'm Marielle. I'm the athletic trainer over at Prehab San Diego. And then Gabby and Jaclyn, if you guys want to introduce yourselves as well.
Sure. Hi, I'm Jaclyn Sklaver, licensed dietitian. My background's in functional medicine, sports nutrition. I'm the owner of Athleats Nutrition, and we work with everybody from active gym goers, people training for events like marathons, through professional athletes, as well as student athletes in achieving their athletic goals, body composition goals, rehabilitation, recovery, all of the fun stuff.
Great. And I'm Gabby. I'm a registered dietitian and I'm a certified specialist in sports dietetics. And I work with an active population. My specialty is in working with athletes, specifically runners, college athletes, high school athletes. And I also work in behavioral eating in terms of helping with disordered eating, athletes with disordered eating, relative energy deficiency in sport, which is a condition that can occur if some athletes not consuming enough energy, and also in eating disorders.
Wonderful. Thank you guys for joining us today. So besides being an athletic trainer, I also recently got my sports nutrition coach certification. So one tier down from you guys, of course. So I'm going to defer to you guys. Feel free to give your 2 cents on anything I'm about to share. So we'll have a little presentation in the beginning, and then we'll open it up to the Q&As for Jaclyn and Gabby afterward. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to my PowerPoint. And let's go to slideshow. Okay, can everyone see once it loads? There we go. Let me back it on up. Can everyone see the screen? Okay. Perfect. All right. So just kind of going over the sports nutrition side of things, we'll go touch in on recovery, timing, things of that nature. So for at least my purpose as a sports nutrition coach, I am not a registered dietitian. So there is that difference between the two. No license is required for a sports nutrition coach. And our goal is to work with athletes on consuming just a well-rounded, healthy diet and the risk of developing nutrient deficits and hydration education. So we're going to focus more on the education and advice side of things. The registered dietitian is going to be the one that can give you a plan of what to eat, when to eat it, a little bit more specific things like that, as well as being trained at a university degree level. There it goes. Okay. So the big component of the nutrition side of things is going to be the protein, the carbs, and the fats. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the timing. This is when Jaclyn and Gabby feel free to provide your input as well. So going through my course, protein, it should be about 20 to 40 grams per meal. Going to be very dependent on the person and just what your own personal macro goals are as well, and what sport you do. Some sports are going to require a little bit more protein than others. But the protein post-exercise is more important for resistance training, as resistance exercises are what's priming the muscle to respond to the dietary amino acid ingestion. And then post-exercise protein has a larger window than we actually think. I think it's really common to hear that you should be having your protein shake immediately after the workout. But really, the more important aspect is going to be if you are hitting your overall new protein goal throughout the day. So you have a window of more than 4 to 6 hours post-exercise instead of needing to drink it or eat protein immediately after. And then the studies are showing that the best way to optimize protein intake is having 4 meals with 20 to 40 grams every 3 hours. So getting that constant digestion of protein, and as well as having protein before sleep can provide the protein remodeling during sleep as well. So that's just another way to optimize the timing of it. In regards to the sports side of things, the USDA guideline for the average human is going to be 0.8 grams per kilograms of body weight. And then when it comes to athletes, you're looking at anywhere from 1.4 up to 2.2 grams of kilogram of body weight. For our purpose here at Prehab, we see a lot of the endurance athletes like our marathon runners. So that's when we're kind of finding that middle ground of 1.2 to 1.6, because the protein's important for maintaining skeletal mass, mitochondrial recovery, and then also tendon and ligament remodeling. So someone recovering from an injury, that can be important to utilize that as well. Interestingly enough, athletes that are over 40 years, so our masters runners, are going to need slightly higher protein levels. So that's going to be a 1.6 to 2 grams. And then biological females may require slightly higher protein intake versus males, just due to how our menstrual cycle plays a role into everything. Moving on to the carbohydrate side of things, at rest, our human body obtains less than 50% of its energy needs from carbs, but as exercise increases, the body draws around 80%. So this is where carbohydrates are going to play a bigger role for more of those endurance athletes. The rate at which muscle glycogen stores are used depends on the intensity at which exercise is performed. After 2 hours of moderate steady state exercise, about 60% of someone's VO2 max, stores are almost completely depleted. So this is why when someone's running a half marathon or marathon, you need that constant use of the gels and the goos and that side of things to make sure you are constantly having energy intake to help with the energy output that's going on while running. Your daily carb intake aims to maintain the glycogen within the muscle and the liver to delay onset of fatigue and enhance performance. I've heard stories time and time again of a runner running their first half marathon, and they'll stay after, mile 5, 6, 7, that they just lost all of their energy. And it wasn't until they learned more about the nutritional side and the supplementation with the goos that they realized that they had just fully hit their burnout and they were at that fatigue side of things. And so they needed to incorporate the goos to re-energize and make it through the rest of the long race. And then the ACSM recommends daily carb intake is about 3 grams per kilogram for low intensity, and then all the way up to 12 grams per kilograms for endurance athletes. So I thought this chart was going to be really helpful, especially for our runners. You actually want your pre-exercise meal to be consumed 3 to 4 hours prior to competition and contain about 1 to 4 grams per kilograms of carbs. Now, if you have that race at 6 a.m., that does not mean we expect people to wake up at 2 a.m. to eat prior to the race. This is where something like the carb loading, 24 to 48 hours leading up to the race, can play a role. And then you still get that pre-race snack more when you wake up and not necessarily worrying about having a full meal right before race day. And then this chart is going to give us a little bit more about knowing how much we need to have in between the runs, or how much grams we need of carbs during the run based off of the distance. So if you're doing under 30 minutes of an exercise, no specific carb requirement's going to be needed to help the performance. If we have a sustained high intensity, so 30 to 60 minutes, you need just less than 30 grams of carbs. If you have an endurance exercise going 1 to 2.5 hours, so that can be anything from 10K, half marathon. For our really, really fast people, that's a marathon as well. You're just looking at 30 to 60 grams per hour of exercise. So that can help dictate how much goo you're having, when you're having it, etc. And then the ultra endurance, those over the 2.5, most commonly more people's marathon. And then our ultra runners, you're looking at up to 90 grams per hour to maintain those glycogen stores to get you through that long race. For the timing of carbs, that pre-exercise meal is important if exercise is performed early in the day, as it allows intensity to be maintained and it can reduce cognitive fatigue by reducing the increase of serotonin. For the post-exercise meals, you want 1 to 1.1 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight per hour, and that should be consumed within a few hours of completing an exercise. So again, not necessarily something you need to have immediately after, but just within the first couple hours. Your young athletes and athletes greater than 60 have a greater reliance on fat as fuel during exercise, so they may have a reduced carb intake. And then there's actually been no clear evidence showing low carb diets provide a benefit over high carb. So we hear a lot about the keto diet. Basically, the research was showing that while it's not bad for you and it's not necessarily something that's going to hinder your performance, there's also just not enough evidence showing that it's very beneficial for performance. We all have heard about carbohydrate loading, which is going to look a little bit differently than our singular big heavy pasta meal the night before a race. So the goal is to increase the glycogen stores above the normal peak capacity, and they can be enhanced by up to 50%. So you want to follow a high carb diet for 24 to 48 hours leading up to the competition, but you also need to do that with a reduced training load. If I was to increase my carb intake and then still have a heavy workout, I would just be utilizing those carbs for that exercise. So then I'm not actually increasing my glycogen stores. So you're aiming for 8 to 10 grams per kilograms of body mass per day with the reduced training load. And that's going to be something that you're going to want to look towards, so you don't have to wake up at 2 a.m. for the 6 a.m. start time. And then why would you carbo load? Jeez. You can enhance performance by up to 2 to 3% and extend time to fatigue by 20%. And it's going to be best suited for endurance sport lasting more than 90 minutes. For the fat, so this is our last micronutrient. There's no specific requirements for fat when it comes to a nutritional sport nutrition standpoint. Fat is going to be the last micronutrient that we usually create a number for or a goal for. So it's going to fall anywhere between 20 to 35% of calorie intake, and just be based off what our carb and protein requirements are, depending on what our sport is. If you're looking at an endurance athlete, it's going to be less than 30% of the total daily calories to just ensure effective restoration of the intramuscular triglyceride storage. If you're looking at a strength power athlete, it's the last nutrient concern based off percent of goals, timing of a competition, if they're like a bodybuilder, etc. And then if you're an injured athlete, you want it to be closer to that 20 to 35% with an emphasis on omega-3 fatty acids for anti-inflammatory purposes. On the recovery side of things, the primary goal of an athlete should be to restore depleted carbs stores lost from exercising. So carb timing is the most important when the athlete gets minimal rest. I'm thinking of more of a 2 a day for, some of our football players that have summer camp, or I work with a heptathlete, and so she's kind of has little mini practices for 5 hours of a day. So it's really important to maximize that restoration of glycogen during phases like that. Not necessarily as important if you're just having like one workout a day, but you want that 1.2 grams of kilograms immediately after exercise, then every 30 minutes for up to those 4 hours. We call it the 3 R's of recovery. You want to rehydrate, refuel, and repair. If we are looking at the pre-exercise, pre-competition, because we see mostly runners, we get this question a lot. How should they prep for their race? You're looking at the 3 to 4 hours prior to the start, like I had mentioned earlier, based off their specific weight, and then just the timing of it based off the length of their race as well. Same thing for that carbohydrate loading leading into the race day, the 24 to 48 hours prior to, not just the one meal right beforehand. That is the quick rundown. So we can open this up to questions. Jaclyn, Gabby, feel free to speak further more into these side of things as well.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that you went into in the end, which is really important, is that carbohydrate window for refueling. And a lot of people miss that. They just focus on the protein window. And I think when we're doing any type of endurance or even just high performance sports, it could be sprints, it could be football, as you mentioned, basketball, that recovery window is really important, because the more we train, the more we can practice, the better we're going to be at our sport, right? So recovery, the faster we recover, the more we can practice. So I think a lot of people in that bodybuilding world is always telling us like protein, protein, protein. But in our situation for performance athletes in general, that carbohydrate window is like number one, because after about 45 minutes, you said 30, but about 45 minutes, the glycogen, that we can uptake glycogen like a sponge into our muscles at that time period. And so once that time period's over, yes, we still recover, but that like active window shuts down. Our body's just not as receptive. So it takes a little bit longer. So we can really push that recovery. And, in off season, or as you mentioned, 2 a days, like what the name of the game is recover. How fast can we get our body back to where it wants to be? So I'm really glad that you brought that up. And I think, carbs are a huge focus for runners, and Gabby can speak more to the types of carbs and when to use them and how to use them and how they can actually affect people differently. She just ran a half, and once you do it yourself too, you have different experiences, and some people are okay with gels and goos, and some people need solid foods like rice balls that they pop in their mouth, and everyone's gut's different. So I'll let Gabby kind of talk into that.
Right. So I'll talk about the different kinds of carbohydrates. And so we kind of look at them in two different classes of like our complex carbohydrates, where we're looking at things like our grains and our starches. Like grains and potatoes, beans would fall under our complex carbohydrates versus our simple carbohydrates. And in our world, we're looking at things like our fruits. But also when it comes to, performance nutrition, we're looking at those gels, chews, and even like electrolyte drinks that contain carbohydrates. And think about, our starches being more of our take longer to break down in your body, versus, our simple carbohydrates, which will provide a faster amount, will provide glucose and sugar to the muscles, a little bit faster. So we're thinking about nutrient timing of the kinds of foods that you're going to eat is, what kinds of carbohydrates am I eating in that meal, 2 to 4, hours before, versus what am I eating 30 minutes right before, the race starts, or, right before, the gun goes and, I cross that start line. And so when we're thinking about, let's say it's an early morning race, sure, if your time is 6 a.m., 4 a.m. up eating a meal is probably ideal to wake up and have your complex carbohydrates then. So we can think of things like oatmeal, a bagel, doing pancakes, waffles, those kinds of starch-rich foods that are going to be in the body. And obviously you do want a full, complete meal, like was talked about, that's balanced with carbs and proteins and fats, but not too heavy on the fat, because your gut does need to break down this food and your body needs to absorb it. So we don't want too much fat, because that can slow down some of that breakdown and digestion. And then if we're looking, before race time, we want to top off our stores, our glucose stores, right? In our bloodstream with more of a simple carb. So that could be like, very common is like bringing a banana to the race. You go off at like 7:20, maybe around, 6:50, 7 o'clock, you could do that banana. That would be more of our simple carbohydrates. When it comes to during the race, you do also want to focus on, when we're talking about gels and chews, our simple carbohydrates. But because of the way our gut absorbs things, is that we don't want to oversaturate them. So people, a lot of times when they're running, can experience gut issues. And, we call it GI distress in our world, but gut issues, and they might feel like cramping or bloating, or you may hear of like runners going to the bathroom throughout the race. And we want to avoid that. So something that we use, a lot of these gels are formulated to be able to absorb into the gut much better than if you oversaturate it with just like juice, right? If someone's relying on juice, that's one type of simple carb, which is called fructose, right? And so we want multiple simple carbs so your stomach's able to absorb that best. And some of the gels out there are very well designed to do that. But I always recommend to runners and athletes that you do want to test these things out, obviously during your training, and find which ones work best for you. And what kind of, if it's 30 grams per hour, there are different gels and chews that have different amounts of carbohydrates. So figuring out your amount that you need, and that's something that we help people with, is, trial and error of different kinds of carbohydrates before, during, and also after, because we also want to think about a lot of what I mentioned were like sugary foods, right? They are carbs, right? And a lot of the simple carbs, they are sugars. And so working with you on, which types that agree with you, and also your timing and the amount of that.
Another thing we do is like gut training. So if you're somebody who's actually doing a longer endurance race, we actually have to you can train your gut upwards to get used to those carbohydrates. So when we have seen thresholds being pushed of like 100 carbs per hour, we have to use two different pathways. As Gabby mentioned, like we might use like a fructose and a glucose, but we can train your gut slowly to get used to that. Obviously, you never want to go into that right away. And everybody's microbiome is different, and that reflects in which products are going to do best with them. Another thing we work with a lot are people that have underlying health issues. Like if you have autoimmunity and you're sensitive to carbs, if you have PCOS, if you have SIBO or a low FODMAP diet, it doesn't mean that you can't run or you can't be an athlete. And I think a lot of people feel overwhelmed when they come up with those cases, because you're going to go to someone who's just want to help you with your health issue, but you really want to work on your athletic performance. And we really combine that world. And I feel like that's a place where we're really unique in. I've worked with people with some really deep underlying health issues, even helping people find them. Because sometimes, you just feel like you're crazy because you've gone to so many different doctors and they can't help you. But something's, when your body is not right, but you also still want to exercise. And so we really try to help people find that healthy balance and find the underlying health issue. So there are ways that things can be done and individualized, because everybody's gut's different. So like what will work for me might not work for Gabby. Anything else in there that I feel like, did anything stand out? I mean, it was really great. Thanks for that presentation. I appreciate you putting that together. Gabby, was there anything in there that stood out to you?
No, I think that what I wanted to say was, and I'm a professor, so I always tell, this is, a lot of what I teach my students of like, what are the numbers and what what does the research tell us about, the timing and the amounts. And one thing that's really important that I always emphasize is looking at the individual. We have all this amazing data and all this amazing research that is hopefully only going to get better, and it will get better, as, sports nutrition continues to grow. But what's really important is looking at this and applying it to to yourself, to, when working with an individual, that it is an individualistic approach of like, how much can someone tolerate? What do they work best with? And really just, that's the one thing is, in a textbook, we have all this great facts, but what happens now when we start to apply that science, and, what kind of results do people have? And like, does someone do well if they're doing a half marathon they can do great with like 40 grams of carbs, but someone might need a little bit more, and someone might do well with 30 grams of carbs, or even like some of the gels, it might be 25. So it's working on, with an individual and what works best for them, but obviously within those scientific parameters of like what the research is telling us, and also looking at their performance. How is their performance? How is their body feeling? And how is their body recovering from that?
I think it's really important. I think people get lost in the little details where, a lot of it is like what happens in a lab or what happens in a book is not what happens in the field. And so we always keep the science in mind and then try to apply that as well as possible, because it's real life out here and people's lives are not like, oh, every 4 hours, ding, ding, ding. Because how realistic is that? If you're an Olympic athlete, okay, that's your job. But if you are actually in an office and you're doing a like $1 billion deal with some corporate guy, like you can't eat, so we just think about what can really apply and how well we can apply it with like those scientific backgrounds in mind. But a lot of times, especially with social media, we see a lot of like small nuances. And for us, I think it's a lot more of like the big picture, like what small changes can we make? Because I'll be honest with you, a lot of especially runners come to me and I don't know how they do it. They've run a half marathon. They've never even looked at their nutrition. So we're starting with like the basics of how we can help. And we know we can improve things. I mean, whether it be their time or how they feel or their injuries. But definitely can be improvements with like small changes. So we don't even have to like dial things in that much when we're dealing with general population. Like I said, if we're dealing with like the Olympics are coming up and we do have an athlete going there, okay, like we've got science, we've got whiteboards, you know what I mean? But a lot of people forget that it's just, what things can we change that are really easy to change? I want to definitely like find out what questions you guys have, because we could talk about what we know, but it's always great to see what people want to learn about so we can kind of share our knowledge with you.
Yeah, I have a athlete right now. She's been doing half marathons and she keeps reporting like stomach cramping, not during the race, but like even a couple hours after the race. And so we talked a little bit about the rehydration standpoint, and she had like first done just straight water right after. And so I was like, maybe we need a little bit more electrolyte side of things. So I don't know if that's something you guys have seen before, and any advice to help figure out what that could be the potential cause so we can make sure she's not cramping.
So I think a couple things, like electrolytes are incredibly important. We don't want to ever like forget to talk about that, because just drinking water is not enough. Like you need that ion to like pull the water in the cell. But a lot of times, and this is the thing we deal with, we focus on a lot, is the psychological part of eating and nutrition in sports. So fight or flight and rest and digest, you can't be in both at the same time. And a lot of athletes will struggle before or after a competition getting out of fight or flight to get into rest and digest. So it's a real it's your nervous system. And so even helping with like breathing exercises, and I'm sure you know plenty of them as an athletic trainer or physical therapist, that we do like box breathing or quadrupeds or different things just to like kind of bring your central nervous system back, are some things you might also want to think about, because sometimes it's not just what's going into your body, but it's where your mind is and that vagus nerve connection. Gab, have you dealt with that, like cramping after racing?
Not particularly. I can't think off the top of my head, but as Jackie was mentioning, coming out of that fight or flight, and we know during training, like our blood flow is, pulled from our gut to our periphery where it needs to be, right? So to our legs, especially in the case of a runner. So like Jackie was saying, is coming out of that, sympathetic into that parasympathetic nervous system could be helpful. So what's like her, post training recovery looking like? And overall, like stress levels too.
Hi, everybody. I have a question. I'm Zach. Wasn't here for the first part. What are some of the maybe signs that you all would see with somebody you work with where your macronutrient balance is just a bit off? Because I know there's all the recommendations and whatnot. But depending on, like, I have some people who kind of go back and forth between endurance and strength athletes. How would you look at it? Like, oh, it kind of sounds like from things you're experiencing, maybe we need to switch your carbs and your fats a little bit, or anything like that kind of tip you off?
I personally think, and this is something I did want to mention, is that like calories are like calorie balance is going to be really important. So the calories, how much fuel we're actually getting into our body is going to be number one, because that's what we're utilizing for fuel. And then it's going to be our macronutrients. I mean, obviously we don't want 3,000 calories all in fat, because that's not going to do us any good. But when it's like, those are like one of those little nuances of like, if they're strength training and not in an endurance phase, or not even in like a cardiovascular phase, then we can taper down on the carbs. But I think some of the signs that you're going to see are going to be tired. They're going to have like brain fog, needing naps, like irritability, not sleeping well at night. Because what's going to happen also is your cortisol is going to start to creep up a little bit. Then your testosterone is going to start to go down. So lowered sex drive is another one. And it's a lot of these things that like I've actually dubbed as the low T diet, because people will come to us and we know right away without even testing. I bet you their cortisol's high, their testosterone's low. So that's a really good sign. Like say somebody says to you, like, you said, oh, well, you need 3,000 calories. And they're like, well, I've been getting that. Like I'm tracking. And then you look and their carbs are like, they're training to run and their carbs are like 2 grams per kilogram or something. You're like, okay, well, that's why. And you're giving your body's now using gluconeogenesis. It's just, there's so many things going on metabolically. I think that you can see the demands from those signs and symptoms. Gab, what do you think? Any other signs that you really see, or even putting
my first thought was sleep and recovery, but I think you pretty much hit a lot of it. I actually he's not a runner right now, that he was experiencing a lot of these symptoms, like exhausted in the afternoon, and like he was eating enough calories, but he's doing a different sport, but also demands a high amount of carbohydrates, and switching that and changing that did make a huge difference. And waking up in the morning, and waking up alert, and waking up like feeling like they got sleep. Nutrition plays a huge role in, like Jackie said, like sleep quality, and the amount of time falling asleep and waking up refreshed. So Jackie hit most of what I would say.
I think another thing people have to remember is that if you're underfueled, you can put yourself into a hypothyroid state, which you do not want. Because listen, hypothyroidism is not fun, and we can induce that in ourselves, and we can even push autoimmunity on ourselves. And so some of the things we see with that might be like starting to see hair thinning or hair loss, dry skin. With women, with women, we can, as soon as like the menses stop or something like that, or it's off. And a lot of times with women, and I was guilty of it in my 30s, thinking, oh, like, is this just because I'm in my 30s? And I was like under eating for my training. Like we make up excuses in our head because we don't want to think. And I don't even have an eating disorder. It's just like, it's the last thing you think about. You just think, oh, well, I'm a week late. It's because I don't, and no, it's because I wasn't eating enough food to keep up my
Mhm.
training. So think about those things. I always tell women, especially if you're an athletic, track your period. There's no downside to it. At some point in your life, you are going to want to have this data, and the more data you have, the better. So if we can look at those trends as well, it's going to be really helpful. But, under doing carbs and under fueling can definitely put yourself in a hypothyroid state, and we don't want that. So, and then I think another thing I'd love to talk about is like iron levels, especially in endurance athletes and in
Mhm.
women and everybody. Iron's really important for athletes. And most athletes are low in iron. And so, we lose iron in our sweat. Iron is used for our blood, which is going to help our nutrients get to, our red blood cells. And so I think it's really important that people are eating a diet that is a balanced diet in proteins. And it's okay if you want to be plant-based or vegan, you're just going to have to really put in that extra effort to make sure you're getting your iron in, because you need double the amount of non-heme iron foods like vegetables to get in the same thing as a meat, because your body just doesn't absorb it, similar to protein. It's actually less absorption though. And so if people do decide they want to be plant-based, they need to really be aware of like how we're doing other things to get that in. If you probably have to supplement, and then also just in general, not combining foods, even if you're not plant-based, that are going to inhibit your iron absorption when you are eating iron, or taking foods in that are going to help iron absorption. So I think iron is something that kind of gets skipped over until we see, and then, we can catch that before it becomes anemia,
Mhm.
which is what we'd ideally like to do.
Right. And like low iron or iron deficiency, will impact and will impact performance, because iron is what's bringing oxygen to the muscles and delivering it. Also with endurance athletes, as some of you may have heard, is like foot strike hemolysis, which is the pounding of the feet on the pavement, which can contribute to destruction of red blood cells and can also contribute to some anemia as well. It's not like this massive thing, but if somebody is already, at risk for iron deficiency or an anemia, that is something else that we do want to be mindful of.
I think overall, it's interesting. Like a lot of people don't realize how complex the nutrition side is, especially when you're doing to me, running is a really serious sport. It puts such a metabolic demand on your body, whether you're sprinting, whether you're doing endurance. I mean, even if you're doing like 3 miles, every other day, it's still putting a lot of stress on your body. And I think it's one of these sports where people have gotten away without paying attention to nutrition for so long, but it's a sport that really should be dialed into it. And it's not just about like, am I getting in my carbs and my protein, but there's so much more, because every system in your body is kind of connected. Because I even think in my head, okay, iron also is part of thyroid, hormone. You need to have your iron for your thyroid to work correctly. And then you need to have your estrogen working correctly for your thyroid. So it's like this big web that we weave. And when one thing comes disconnected, then we can start to see a lot of symptoms and signs, and people are like, what's going on? And then in major cities like New York City, people are pounding the streets, right? So they're literally, the stress is high. You're walking everywhere. Which right then and there increases your caloric needs. When I lived in New York City most of my life, my clients, I didn't go off a typical resting metabolic rate times activity multiplier for people. I always did a little bit extra, because people are walking 10,000 steps easy, if not more, on top of their exercising, and up and down the stairs on the subway and carrying their bags. And so we also want to think about the physical and the mental stress that living in a major city does on you as well.
Another question I have would be, if you have someone that's tracking everything, we calculated the total energy expenditure, what their macro should be, we feel like they're hydrating correctly, when would be the point of okay, maybe they need to get blood work done, or would blood work be the next step, or what would that kind of avenue look like?
So I'm really big on labs and blood work. I tell people I don't have to have it because I'm really good at what I do and I can go off signs and symptoms, but it can't hurt. And it's so either you're your doctor can order it for you, or it's pretty cheap to order blood work. I mean, I do a full comprehensive panel for 160 maybe. And we're looking at everything you need to look at for an athlete. Or like I said, a lot of doctors, if you're close with your GP, they'll prescribe, they'll do a script. So I think that it can't hurt to look at blood work in the beginning. I will say this, if you are training very heavily, you're going into a race or marathon, the best time to do blood work is when you're not overtraining, because it is going to throw off your labs. So, and there's inflammation can throw off ferritin, which can throw off iron. So it would be great if you're just in a phase of, maybe just a regular training phase would be the best time to do it. Or somebody who hasn't like not worked out and now all of a sudden they're working out a lot and they want to do labs right away because they want to start working with a nutritionist. So I usually say, okay, let's wait till you're like 3 weeks into this program. And so things have, your inflammation's kind of calmed down a little bit. But I don't think there's ever too soon, other than the fact that if you're in a high training phase, you don't want to do it. But it can't hurt. Some people's theory is like test, don't guess. And then some people feel like we don't have to test. I think I'd rather see the numbers. You just have to make sure you can interpret it correctly.
What are everyone's thoughts on time restricted feeding for athletes? I know it's a can of worms, but I've had people who like it for sleep improvements as well as for like mental clarity.
I feel like that's an oxymoron. I'm gonna be straight up honest. Like time restricted feeding and athletes do not go. It's like not even a thing. Like you can't. It's like, how do you not fuel your workout? Like it's like, how do I feel about driving my Porsche without gas in it? I mean, it would ruin my car, right? How do I feel about putting like like the car dealer would be like, why, this isn't covered under warranty. We told you to put super in it. You know what I mean? And that's, to me, is what it sounds like. You can't fuel yourself with no fuel. Gab, what do you think?
I just think that for so many athletes with such a high calorie demand, it is, I mean, I was just right before this, that was my call with my client. He needs a lot of calories. And his issue right now is we have to wake up an hour earlier now to start eating. And when you're time restricted feeding, you're closing that window even more. And the only benefit that we have seen in time restricted feeding is in individuals who do want to lose weight, is just cutting off cutting off them eating extra, right? Eating excess calories maybe later in the day. But in terms of like any kind of metabolic or any kind of like performance enhancing, we don't see that. And like I said, like getting in enough calories is many times with these athletes who, especially runners, running, 3, 4, 5 times a week, training 5, 6 days a week, they need a lot of calories, even on their off days, to recover. So closing that window just makes getting enough calories in even more challenging.
Another thing I want to mention is a lot of times when I work with people that are new runners, they'll say to me, well, I just ran like whatever, I don't know, 5K, half marathon, and I gained weight. Like I gained weight. And I'm like, yeah, that's very, very common. Ramadan's wrapping up. And like another thing, Ramadan people will gain weight during Ramadan. So you think, well, they're fasting half the day. Well, what happens is if you're not following a nutrition program, I don't care what your sport is, even if you're bodybuilding, and you are starting a new sport, you're hungry and you don't have that regulation in your body. So you're actually going to overeat. And if you're trying to do things, oh, I want to lose weight, that's why I picked up running. What's going to happen is your brain, like your body's smarter than you. By the end of the day, you're going to end up like binging or snacking or eating tons of stuff. So you hear people say, oh, well, I barely eat. And then they do a food log. Well, they ate like 2,000 calories in bites and handfuls of this and nuts and stuff. And it's like, well, I'd rather you do an actual full meal. So I've never met anybody who is actually under eating and not losing weight. So I often meet runners that just don't understand why they're putting on weight. And I'm like, because you have to follow a nutrition program, especially if you plan on losing weight while you're doing this output, because you will end up overeating your calories. A big thing I see also are like the juices with runners, because they're like, oh, well, I'm just going to have a juice. And next thing you know, it's like 60 carbs in this juice, 60 carbs in that juice, and like low protein, really high simple sugars and juices. And I'm not sure where that really comes from, but they love to juice. And I'm like, okay, that is a lot of carbs in a small, or like dates. Like dates, I love using dates for a great carb, 10 carbs in a small date. But somebody who does like a handful of them doesn't realize, oh, you just had 100 carbs in one little handful, plus a handful of nuts, so there's the right ways to do it. I know I'm not trying to demonize any foods, but these are just habits that I see. It's overeating. You can overeat healthy foods for sure.
Yeah, I feel like that's half the education is just like portion sizes, and like especially eating out, what the portion sizes given are ridiculously overdone. And so that's usually kind of like you were saying, was looking at the big picture, is like I'll just teach people like just get a rough estimate of what's going on, and then let's see what we can change. Sometimes just remove the soda or remove the Red Bull or whatever it is. And then same thing, actually look at what a serving size is and follow that. Because I did that myself and I realized how much extra I was adding on. And I was like, okay, there's the problem right then and there.
Yeah, it's an eye-opening experience. I mean, that's another thing that we do with people is really look at like what are their habits outside of their training, like on the weekends, when they're socializing, when they're traveling. When you're on an airplane, people like travel a lot in the airplane and, or waking up early can make you hungry and you're just eating whatever, or you should bring food with you. Like preparing people for that lifestyle change, because it is of like packing and bringing, and if you don't want to pack and bring, then be prepared when you land of what you're going to have to eat. So you're not, when you get to that point of being super hungry, it's not good and you make any type of decision, like eat those airport snacks that are for a whole family, right? Like they don't even have individual size stuff. So we always try to like teach people and prepare them.
What are some of the real food options that you've given people for fueling for endurance races and things like that? So we can, I guess, have other options other than the gels and the goos and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's really dependent on people. Like biking obviously is a little bit easier to do like with like the portable foods and stuff like that. But people like to make like their own sticky rice things. There's like cookbooks out there that runners have put out. Gabby might know better than me. Some people like to do like sticky rice with like jerky in it. It depends if they're like a savory over a sweet person. Gab, anything in particular you've seen on the road?
Like little sandwiches and things like that people
Like
have made. There's also this product that came out. I don't know how popular it is, but it's like a potato. It's like, those pouches where they had like more of those savory pouches with like a potato puree in there, because you do get like at the end of my at the end of my half marathon, I looked at my family and I was just like, I want nothing with sugar in it for like that. Like they gave out Gator. I wanted no sugar because like it's a short rate. It's, I mean, short in the world of endurance, right? A half marathon is shorter than a marathon, obviously, but like you just get taste fatigue. So having other options of like savory, if you're doing an ultra, endurance race, a 50K race, like having other options is really important. Because you do get that taste fatigue where, you're just like, I don't want any more sugar in my mouth right now.
Yeah, that's just a good point. Is those like squeezy things and like almost
Mhm.
baby, to be honest, the baby food
Yeah.
brands, the organic baby food brands, excuse me, they make some better options. So it's not just like the apple sauces and stuff like that, but
Yeah.
and even beets and carrots and it all depends.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So when you have like an athlete, usually I find this, so like I used to run track in college, and a lot of the times, I know that we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I would always tell my teammates like they needed to eat before they came to practice. And right, we would have a 6 a.m. So what college student's gonna wake up and cook a whole, course meal, right, to eat? And so something I've heard was if you like backload the day before, right? So if you eat a really solid meal and then maybe wake up and have a granola bar, that would be sufficient. Is that like a correct thought process or not?
So it depends. I've used that with some of my athletes that like, especially my college guys that are like, I just can't eat in the morning. Like I feel like I'm gonna get sick going in, or they'll throw up in practice because they're not used to it. I work with a lot of guys coming out like declaring for draft NBA and NFL, and they've never trained that hard and they get sick. So we do implement like a really heavy carb backload at night. In the morning, I tell them like something small. And once again, we train their gut. It will work. Like you start with like the Belvitas or like something like a piece of toast. And then we slowly get more, because what's going to happen is within like a week or so, your body's going to start to get hungry when you wake up, which is great.
Mhm.
So like if I said to you, oh, you have to eat an omelet and waffles and syrup and fruit, you're going to go out and throw up. You're going to hate me. So it's really smart to do that where yes, backload. And then in the morning, have something small and then slowly but surely add on to it.
Yeah. I think a lot of people are hesitant to eat that early, because they've had those experiences. So they think it's like an all or nothing, but giving them that education and building like a little trust by doing like a little bit of this. I've even done people just having a couple of gulps of like orange juice in the morning before they went into practice, just to slowly, or like a little couple sips, making a smoothie, doing like a quarter of it, and just like slowly increasing the amount too. And they will be able to consume that.
And some
But
people
the
are
education
better.
piece is key. Go ahead.
Some people are better with solids than liquids. Some people with liquids, they like keep them down. They're great. Some people with liquids, they can throw up. And some people
Mhm.
are better with like just doing a solid food. Everyone's a little bit different. Some people feel better doing a liquid food. Everyone's digestion time is different too. So that also depends on how quick they can and like what that time period is. And also like how dedicated are you? You know, sometimes my athletes like, I don't want to wake up earlier. You know, I'm like, well, you know, do you want to get drafted or do you want to get to this college scholarship or do you want to win this race? Like you put that training in, you're on the court or you're out there like 3 times a day. So you have to put that energy into your food too. So you have to do things you don't want to do to get results that you want. Short of getting sick. You don't want to get sick.
Okay, another question that I have is if you suspect an athlete has either like the athlete triad or like a loss of a period, something that I've heard like two ways. I've heard that like you stop the athlete from competing completely until you can like get them back on track and then progress them back, or you can do both. Like, what is your take on that? Do you stop them or do you try and implement other things so that they can still be a competitor?
Mhm. I think that's complex. And I am dealing with that now. I think what's most important is one, seeing, what are their symptoms, and then also you got to get the labs of, what their hormone is, especially when we're looking at a woman, we need to look at their estrogen levels, and where they are. And the other thing is, you know, if they need 2,500 calories, right? Or 3,000. I mean, if someone does have amenorrhea and low estrogen, we do need to get that up, and they do need to eat significantly, more calories. And are they eating that much? The typical recommendation is, um, looking at their calorie intake. Is it enough? And are we putting them in harm's way? So like textbook would be like, and it depends. Is it an eating disorder or is it just red S and they just don't know to eat enough and they start eating more? If it is an eating disorder, depending where they are, if it's like an active anorexia or even like a restrict binge purge, eating disorder, it really depends on the case. But like textbook would say, they have return to play charts that would say, athlete is experiencing this, this, and this, what is their weight? What is their BMI as well? And sometimes even if they are at a healthy weight or a healthy BMI, but their labs are, showing, hormone deficiencies and that they're low, you have to use your best judgment on that. I mean, I have an athlete right now who like her scholarship depends on her playing, right? Like she's not going to stop playing. So it's really about right now, like, hey, you need 2,500 calories and this is the best I could tell you. After that, it's their decision. I can't tell them that. I can't stop them from playing. So a lot of that is dependent on that, but we have to look at like the whole picture of the athlete, what the situation is. And if they're voluntarily going to run a half marathon, it's like, hey, you're experiencing, all of these signs and symptoms of red S, and you can't, right now we're not eating enough, and it's, a challenge for you to get up that calories. Like, I strongly recommend you're not running this race and we stop training until we can restore you and get enough calories. Under eating calories and trying to compete and perform will have more harm to your body. Then, people think that like, I'm going to race to lose weight. I'm going to race to lose weight. But if you're not meeting, your energy demands to keep up that high intensity training, you could be doing more damage to your body than not competing.
Regarding the BMI aspect, how much do you guys like to look at just the weight number, the BMI number, or even like the body fat percentage number? Because especially dealing with athletes, if I have a power lifter, obviously his BMI may not necessarily be the most accurate to look at.
I don't look at BMI on the high end. I really just use it for the low end.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Also looking at weight trends, right? So have they lost a significant amount of weight? What percentage of their body weight, if they have lost weight? That can also be indicative too, because you might not see a BMI of, 17, which would be, low. But if someone has lost like 20 pounds in the span, in a short amount of time, that can be indicative of like low energy availability as well. So like, yes, we want to use BMI on the lower end, but even more so, like, let's look at what their weight trend was. And sometimes like we may think of, oh, weight loss as, a positive thing. In athletes, sometimes weight loss is not, a positive thing, and even general weight loss cannot be, a positive thing. It could be indicative of something else going on if it's not intentional, or if it's a very high amount of weight in a short amount of time. And so I think that BMI is an indicator, but even if someone is still within that normal BMI range but lost a significant amount of weight, it is like something of a red flag to look at.
And I think when it comes to the higher end, I'm more concerned with like metabolic syndrome. Like we know that half of high school football players have metabolic syndrome before they even go into college. So when we're dealing with somebody who needs to be at a certain weight, like a heavier weight for their sport, I'm more concerned about the inflammation and what's going on inside their body than I am like, looking at their BMI with their muscle mass is just going to throw things off. But if someone has to be like, 300 to 340 pounds, and I have to see what's going on in their body. And the teams won't do that. So they don't want to know. So I think it's really important when we're dealing with like the higher end to look at that.
Cool. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. That was really helpful. Hopefully everyone got something to take away out of that. And then we have it recorded, so we'll be able to have access to that for anyone else that wasn't able to tune in with us. But appreciate everyone's time, and hopefully everyone has a good rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think Emma had it recording, so if she can unrecord it.
Okay.
Or able to. I don't know if I don't think we can hit stop
I think
recording.
I can.